What if I told you the most powerful empire in modern history doesn't control vast colonies, wield a massive army, or conquer land by force, but dominates the globe with something far quieter? What if the greatest weapon of the last century wasn't nuclear, but financial? You've been told America became a superpower through innovation, military strength, or the spread of democracy. But behind those stories lies a more invisible, strategic campaign. One where the real battlefield was banks, oil markets, and international finance. This is the story of how the United States transformed its currency into the world's most powerful weapon. It begins not with strength, but with chaos. The early 20th century saw Europe as the financial heart of the world. The British pound sterling was the international reserve currency. The pound wasn't just a unit of exchange, it was a symbol of trust and imperial reach. Countries around the world held it, traded in it, and used it to settle international debts. The United States was still an emerging player, not yet the financial leader we know today, but the foundations were forming. As the US industrialized, it grew richer and more self-reliant, but no one could have predicted what 2 world wars would do to the existing world order. World War I shattered the economic might of Europe. The cost of war pushed Britain, France, and Germany into immense debt. By the end of the war, the US had become the world's largest creditor. European nations owed American banks billions. Then came the Great Depression, plunging the entire world into economic despair. And when things seemed they couldn't get worse, World War II began. This time the destruction was even more comprehensive. By 1945, Europe was devastated. Cities reduced to rubble. Economies collapsed. Colonies demanded independence. Old empires had run out of money, and more importantly, out of credibility. The United States had loaned enormous amounts to its allies, and again emerged on top, this time not only as the largest economy, but also as the only one left standing with its industrial base intact. More importantly, it held over 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. This gave the US a once-in-a-century opportunity. In 1944, as World War II was still raging, 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to rebuild the global financial system. They knew the old ways had failed. They needed stability, a new framework for trade, and a way to avoid the hyperinflation and currency collapse that had plagued the interwar period. There were 2 competing visions for the post-war world. The British economist John Maynard Keynes proposed a supranational currency, the Bancor. It would be managed by an international clearing union, designed to prevent any one country from becoming too dominant. It was a way to distribute power fairly. But the United States had its own agenda. Representing the US was Harry Dexter White, a Treasury official who saw a historic opening. The US wasn't interested in neutrality. It wanted leadership. White proposed a system where the US dollar would become the world's central currency, convertible into gold at $35 an ounce. Other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar, and the US would essentially serve as the global banker. Most nations, too weak to argue, accepted the deal. Thus, the Bretton Woods system was born. The dollar was now at the center of global trade, international loans, and central bank reserves. But there was a catch. It only worked because the dollar was supposedly as good as gold. Foreign governments trusted that they could exchange dollars for gold on demand. That trust was the cornerstone. In the short term, the system delivered. The post-war boom, fueled by American industry, global reconstruction, and new trade flows, gave rise to decades of prosperity. Europe rebuilt, Japan industrialized. The dollar became a symbol of stability. But underneath the surface, a tension was building. As the US spent more on domestic programs and military engagements, especially the Vietnam War, it began printing more dollars than it had gold to back. Foreign countries started to take notice. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, became especially vocal. He called out what he referred to as the US's exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money and export inflation while other countries held the bag. In 1965, France sent a warship to New York to redeem dollars for gold. It wasn't just France. West Germany, Switzerland, and other countries also began redeeming dollars for gold. The outflows were massive. The gold reserves in Fort Knox began to shrink. The United States was being called to honor its promise, but the gold simply wasn't there. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation with an announcement that would change the world. He unilaterally suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. Just like that, the core promise of Bretton Woods was broken. Dollars were now backed by nothing. This decision, known as the Nixon Shock, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. Global leaders panicked. Economists warned of chaos, a currency unmoored from anything tangible. It seemed reckless. But here's the twist. The world kept using the dollar anyway. Why? Because even after the gold link was severed, there was no alternative. America still had the biggest economy, the deepest capital markets, and the most military power. Trust in the dollar had taken on a life of its own, but the US knew that trust wasn't enough. It needed to ensure continued demand, so it struck a new, silent deal, this time not with economists, but with oil barons. In the mid-1970s, the US reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection and political support, the Saudis would price oil exclusively in US dollars. This became the petrodollar system. Soon, all of OPEC followed. From that point on, any country that wanted to buy oil, whether it was Germany, China, or India, first had to get US dollars. This created constant global demand for the currency. But it also gave the United States an extraordinary advantage. Other countries had to earn or borrow dollars to survive. The US, meanwhile, could just print them. Even as the gold window closed, the oil window opened, and it was just as effective. The dollar's dominance was no longer about convertibility. It was about necessity. The global economy now ran on oil, and oil ran on dollars. This gave rise to the second age of dollar supremacy. Banks around the world began stockpiling dollars. International trade was priced in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. Central banks held dollars in reserves. The US had built an invisible empire, one without borders, flags, or armies. It was an empire of finance. But this empire came with consequences. Developing countries, eager to grow, borrowed heavily in dollars. When interest rates in the US rose, these debts became unpayable. Latin America suffered a lost decade in the 1980s. Africa's growth stalled. Southeast Asia was devastated by the 1997 crisis. The US, through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, would offer bailout loans on the condition that countries imposed austerity, cut spending, and privatized industries. This often caused more harm than good. These weren't just financial arrangements, they were tools of influence. Meanwhile, within the US, a different transformation was taking place. The economy began to shift from production to finance. Manufacturing declined. Wall Street boomed. The dollar's global role allowed the US to run massive trade deficits without immediate consequences. Other countries exported goods and imported American paper. The rest of the world worked. America consumed. By the 2000s, this imbalance became extreme. The US was running trillion-dollar deficits. Foreign countries, especially China, were holding mountains of US debt. And then, in 2008, the system cracked. The financial crisis exposed the rot at the core of the dollar empire. US banks collapsed under the weight of bad loans and reckless derivatives. Trust in American institutions wavered. Economists worldwide feared that this time the dollar would fall. But once again, something remarkable happened. As panic spread, investors didn't flee the dollar. They rushed to it. Central banks bought even more US treasuries. The Federal Reserve printed trillions. The dollar wasn't punished for the crisis. It was rewarded. Why? Because even after everything, there was still no alternative. The 2008 financial crisis should have been the moment the dollar lost its crown. After all, it was Wall Street that triggered the collapse. American institutions failed. Millions lost homes, jobs, and pensions. And yet, ironically, the world still turned to the dollar for safety. It was a paradox. The very system that caused the meltdown was still considered the safest. But outside the spotlight, challengers were forming. The European Union had launched the euro in 1999 with the dream of becoming an alternative reserve currency. It had the size, the sophistication, and the ambition. For a brief moment, it looked like the euro might rise to rival the dollar. But internal divisions, structural flaws, and sovereign debt crises, particularly in Greece, Spain, and Italy, crippled its momentum. The euro lacked a unified fiscal policy. It was a monetary union without political cohesion, and trust once again proved more powerful than technical design. Meanwhile, China had been rising quietly but steadily. Its economy exploded after joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. It became the world's factory. It amassed trillions in reserves, mostly in dollars. But China didn't want to be forever dependent on the US. It began pushing for the yuan, its own currency, to play a greater global role. It created new trade agreements that used local currencies instead of dollars. It launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It pushed for the UN's inclusion in the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights basket. It even started pricing some oil contracts in yuan. And yet, despite all the headlines, most of the world didn't switch. Why? Because financial power isn't just about economics. It's about trust, transparency, legal protections, and openness. China's capital controls, censorship, and political risk made other countries hesitate. Then came the digital revolution, and with it a new contender, cryptocurrency. In 2009, as the world reeled from the financial crisis, a mysterious figure named Satoshi Nakamoto released Bitcoin, a decentralized digital currency that operated outside the control of any government. It was hailed by many as the future of money. Borderless, trustless, immune to central banks. By the late 2010s, Bitcoin had inspired thousands of copycats. Ethereum introduced smart contracts. Stablecoins pegged to the dollar gained traction. Decentralized finance, DeFi, emerged as a parallel ecosystem. But crypto's volatility, regulatory uncertainty, and fragmented nature kept it from replacing fiat currencies, especially on a global scale. It was clear, every potential rival to the dollar, whether euro, yuan, or Bitcoin, had its own flaw. None could replicate the unique mix of size, liquidity, legal protection, and geopolitical leverage the dollar provided. But even empires built on trust have limits. Fast forward to the 2020s. The United States began using its control over the financial system as a geopolitical weapon. It sanctioned countries like Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, cutting them off from SWIFT, the global banking messaging system. These moves were effective, but they sent a chilling message to the rest of the world. The dollar wasn't neutral. Then came the Russia-Ukraine war. In response to the invasion, the US and its allies froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves. This move shocked the international community. For the first time, a major power's sovereign reserves, supposedly untouchable, had been seized. It wasn't just a sanction, it was a signal. Countries began to ask if they disagreed with US policy, could their reserves be next? China accelerated its efforts to de-dollarize. It increased gold purchases. It signed more UN-settled trade agreements. India, Brazil, and other BRICS countries began exploring alternative payment systems. The dollar wasn't collapsing, but the pillars were eroding. The most telling indicator? Since 2001, the dollar's share of global central bank reserves has declined from over 70% to around 58%. It's still dominant, but the trajectory is clear. At the same time, America's own financial position has deteriorated. As of 2025, the US national debt exceeds $34 trillion, more than the entire annual output of the US economy. Interest payments alone consume over $1 trillion per year. And yet the US keeps borrowing. Because it can, because the world still wants its debt. But this dynamic only works if confidence remains intact. If trust fades, even slightly, the consequences could be severe. A mass shift out of the dollar could trigger inflation, collapse the bond market, and force painful fiscal decisions. It could end the era of cheap credit and easy money. And once confidence is lost, it's almost impossible to regain. So where does this leave us? Let's break down 3 hard-earned lessons from this century-long journey. First, financial power is more enduring than military power. Empires rise and fall, but the institutions they build can shape the world long after the armies go home. The US dollar became a silent empire, controlling resources, decisions, and policies, not with guns, but with money. Second, trust is the most valuable currency. The dollar has no intrinsic value. It's not backed by gold. It's not pegged to oil anymore. Its power lies in belief. Belief that the US will honor its debts, enforce contracts, and uphold its institutions. Lose that trust, and everything unravels. Third, every empire overreaches. Rome debased its currency. Britain overspent on war. And now, the US runs massive deficits, weaponizes finance, and assumes the dollar's dominance is permanent. But history teaches us that no currency rules forever. The Dutch guilder, the Spanish silver real, the pound sterling, all had their moment and all fell. The warning signs are here. Countries are building alternatives, parallel systems, new alliances, digital currencies, gold reserves are growing again, and for the first time in decades, serious conversations are happening about what comes next. It won't happen overnight, but make no mistake, the world is preparing for a future beyond the dollar. The question is the US? If the dollar loses its status as the global reserve, the consequences will be swift. Borrowing will become more expensive, inflation could spiral, the military's global reach could shrink, domestic programs may face cuts, and the American standard of living, propped up by decades of financial privilege, may come under pressure. This isn't fear-mongering, it's history repeating. So what does this mean for you? It means that understanding financial systems isn't just for economists or bankers. It means questioning the narratives we've been taught. And it means preparing for a future where the rules of money may be rewritten. Because the real battlefield isn't in headlines. It's in balance sheets, trade flows, and currency swaps. The next great war may not be fought with missiles. It may be fought with spreadsheets. If you want to better understand how these invisible forces shape your world, subscribe. Because this story of power, money, and trust isn't over. It's only just beginning. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, empires built on paper can burn just as easily as those built on stone.